Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I'm George Herrera with the Queen's Home team at Keller Williams Realty. Have you ever wondered about basements versus cellars in New York City and how it works, whether you can rent them or not? Here today, that's what we're going to be covering. So I wanted to discuss basements versus cellars and also talk about the laws in New York City regarding actually occupying the space and whether you can rent them or not. So I actually printed the basement and cellar occupancy law from the Department of Buildings website, so I'll link it in the description below also. But this will just give you a quick breakdown, and I'll also give you a little bit of explanation from my point of view. Okay, so first, basements and cellars differ in their amount above curb level. So that's really what you need to know regarding basements versus cellars. A basement typically has more than half of the space is above curb level or above ground level, and in a cellar, more than half of the space is actually below curb level. You can usually tell whenever you look at a basement if it has the small windows, those windows that you can barely fit through, that a person probably couldn't even get through, then those are usually cellars. Okay, a basement, technically the way New York City defines it, a basement is actually when more than half of the building, so more than half of the floor, right, is actually above ground level. And you can usually tell because they always have bigger windows. When you go into the apartment, usually it's almost like a walk-in, if not a walk-in, and you usually, if you look out of the window, you can see the ground, and you can see that more than half of it usually is above ground level of the basement, right? So that's the difference between a basement and a cellar. So a lot of times we're selling properties, or you might see a property that says finished basement, or it might market it as having a basement, but in reality, technically speaking, the way New York City Department of Buildings defines it, if more than half of the basement or the cellar, if more than half of that floor is below ground level or below the curb level, then it's actually considered a cellar. Okay? Now, basements and cellars in residential properties of all sizes can never be lawfully rented or occupied unless certain conditions are met. And there's a lot of conditions here. So if you know New York City, you know that if you want to lawfully rent a basement or any other apartment, anything in your property, there are a lot of conditions that need to be made to make sure that that it is actually livable. Okay, so that for usually 95% of the time, basements, cellars can never be lawfully rented or occupied. But if you do go through the city, you follow the proper proper protocol, and you actually legalize a basement for living space, then you can actually have bedrooms in there, and on some occasions with single families, you might actually be able to rent. So here's what it says straight from the basement and cellar occupancy law in New York City. Basements in 1 and 2 family homes can be lawfully occupied only if the following conditions are met. Okay, so 1, the room has to comply with the requirements of the Housing Maintenance Code for rooms not located in the cellar or basement. So there's certain conditions, minimum room size, things like that, that in order for you, now what they're saying here, 1 and 2 family homes to be lawfully occupied, not rented, but to actually have bedrooms, right? So in your basement or cellar, the actual rooms in the basement would need to meet the Housing Maintenance Code for New York City for all of the other rooms too. So that's one of the requirements. There's a minimum ceiling height of 7 feet. So if you're thinking of legalizing your basement for living space for bedrooms, but your ceiling height is lower than 7 feet, then you wouldn't meet that requirement. But that's one of the other requirements. Also, the walls as high as ground level must be damp and waterproofed. So it has to be damped and waterproofed because it's a basement, or typically a basement. So this is, cellars can never be legally occupied. Okay, so cellars are out of the question. But if you have more than half of your basement above curb level, then you can actually convert it into legal living space for bedrooms, but only if certain conditions are met. So it has to be damp and waterproofed. Okay. Now the other one is that the basement is occupied only by only members of the family or families occupying the dwelling. What that means is that in 1 and 2 family homes, okay, the basements can be lawfully occupied, but it has to only be occupied by people that are family members. So that means that if you have a family, you have a single family house or a 2 family house, and you have a finished basement and you meet all the requirements, you go through the city to legalize the basement for actual living space. You can have bedrooms there and people can sleep there, but it can only be your family member or people that are family of the owners of that dwelling. So not rented, just occupied, okay, if you meet those requirements. Now, basements in a 1 family home can be lawfully rented only if the following conditions are met. Okay, so again, compliance with the housing maintenance code, minimum ceiling height of 7 feet, walls as high as ground level, damped and waterproofed. The basement has to be occupied by 1 family and does not include boarders. Every room must have at least 1 window. Okay, so in a single family home, a basement can be lawfully rented, but it has to meet all these requirements, and one of them is that every room must have at least 1 window. The bottom of any yard or other required open space can't be higher than 6 inches below the window sill of any of the basement windows. Okay, so that's for single family homes. Now this one, we've actually never come across this. We've never seen or met a homeowner who has a single family house and actually had the basement legalized for renting. We're not sure exactly how that process goes, but based on the basement and cellar occupancy law on Department of Buildings website, it says that if a basement of a single family house, it meets all of the requirements, the necessary requirements, then it can be lawfully rented. That one we don't have so much experience with. Like I said, 95 to 99% of the time, your basement cannot be rented. Okay, so it's just it is possible to legalize it for living space as long as it's for 1 family. For the same family that owns it, then you could legalize it for bedrooms and people can actually sleep there. Now, the last thing, basements in a 2-family home cannot be lawfully rented. Okay, so if you have a 2-family and you have a basement, your basement cannot be lawfully rented. So it is illegal to rent your basement if you have a 2-family home. If you were to rent it, obviously that's illegal, but what you would want to do is sometimes there's 2-family houses where the first floor is all above ground, an above ground level recreation room, so an above grade basement. And what some people do, if you can meet all the requirements, sometimes people convert the basement into another 3rd dwelling, and then you have to go through the city, follow all the proper channels, and if you actually get certified, then a new certificate of occupancy would be issued to you. So you can have a 2-family house, and if your basement meets all the requirements and everything's above ground and you meet all the housing maintenance codes, then you could actually possibly convert it into a legal 3-family, and then you would get a new C of O. So if you drive around Queens, you'll see sometimes there's these multifamily houses which have 3 floors. Usually those are 2-family houses, and the first floor is not a legal dwelling, but they're popular properties because a lot of times people buy them and they convert that first floor into a legal apartment, making it a legal 3-family. So that's the only way you can lawfully rent a basement, is that if you actually change the C of O to a legal 3-family. But basements, 2-family houses, illegal to rent. Okay, so don't do that. And lastly, cellars. Okay, for cellars, we're talking about basements where more than half of the room is below ground, below curb level. Those can never be lawfully rented. Those can never be rented. So, just don't even do it. Word of advice, we've seen a lot of horror stories from people who rent out their basements. Obviously, it's something that happens in Queens, but we have seen a lot of situations where the owners wish they would have never done it. So if you want to rent your basement out, you have to make sure that you can legally do it. Go through the Department of Buildings, see if you meet all the housing maintenance code, all of the requirements to lawfully rent your basement. If not, then don't do it. If you can legalize it for living space, then at least you know that it's legal for you to have bedrooms, and then people can actually sleep there. But definitely, when it comes to basements and cellars, one of the most important things you want to know is how much of the room is above curb level, how much is below curb level. That lets you know if it's a cellar or a basement. And when it comes to occupying a basement, usually when it's the same family, you can do that, but there are certain requirements that have to be met, whether it's going to be your same family occupying the space, or if you plan to rent. You always want to go through Department of Buildings and make sure that any requirements are being met. Like I said, 95 to 99% of the time, renting out a basement and a cellar is illegal. So be very mindful of that. Okay, so hopefully you learned a little bit here about basements and cellars. I'll leave a link in the description to this law, the basement and cellar occupancy law. That'll give you some more info. If you ever have questions about basements or cellars and whether you can occupy or rent them, then you can always call 311. That's the best way to get some information, or visit the Department of Buildings. All right, thanks for tuning in today, and take care. Have a great day.